Hello and welcome back. This is the week 2 lecture. So today I would really like to walk through the narrative of Cabeza de Vaca. If you are not totally finished with the book yet, that's okay. I'll try to avoid major spoilers. I won't talk too explicitly about the very ending, the very end of the book, although I will have to refer to it kind of obliquely, but I'll leave some of that for you guys to discover if you are still working on the book. But by this point, as we enter week 2, everyone should be at least roughly halfway through the narrative. And I want to talk about some important themes today. I want to talk about some important tropes that we can sort of see operating throughout the book. I want to point you guys to some important passages that you might want to revisit later. If you ever happen to write about this text outside of a discussion post, you'll have chances to. So I just want to point out some important things, talk about some of the most important developments that we can observe over the course of the book. I'm not going to provide really exhaustive plot summary, but I do want to point to a few really important events in the plot so we can understand not only how this expedition goes wrong, because of course that is important, but I also really want us to pay attention to the change that many think occurs in Cabeza de Vaca. You don't necessarily have to agree that he changes in a really foundational way, but certainly his circumstances change, his social situations change, and that's true for his fellow survivors as well. So when I'm reading this book, I often divide it sort of unofficially into two distinct parts. I think of a part 1 and a part 2, and I often think that part 2 really sort of begins around page 100 or so, maybe a touch after, when Cabeza de Vaca is reunited with Castillo, Dorantes, and Estevancio on the Texas coast, and they're able to start sort of making their way southward down the Gulf Coast of Texas. They eventually cross over into Mexico, and around that time, things really change a lot for these guys, as we're going to observe. Their circumstances change. Like I said, their status, their social status will change quite a bit as they encounter new Native American groups around the Rio Grande, and then south of that river as they enter into what is now, of course, modern-day Mexico. So we'll kind of track their journey. Geography does matter a little bit here. We need to sort of keep track of where they are and how their conditions change, largely dependent on where they are and who they are with. But I want to start by going back to a few things we talked about last week as I was sort of introducing the book. We talked about genre. And I mentioned that it's very difficult to classify this text in terms of genre, at least in terms of the way we normally think of genre. In a literature class, when we typically read novels, short stories, some poetry, it might be tempting for us, and I think it's often unavoidable for us to read this book a lot like a novel. We talked a little bit about this before, right? The plot is so improbable. There are so many exciting, death-defying, and very improbable events that we read about over the course of the novel, the book. It often feels a little bit like a novel. So critics have talked about this. One critic named Carlos Fuentes claimed that the book has these sort of fantastical or fantastic elements that make it feel like fiction, even though we do believe for the most part it's true. And he's using the word fantastic in a really traditional sense, meaning imaginative or fanciful, kind of remote from reality, seemingly beyond the normal realm of reality. So because of that fantastic nature of the plot, like we were saying a week ago, this often feels a little bit like an adventure novel, with Cabeza de Vaca serving as our protagonist. There are a few other characters, but he doesn't really do a lot of character development, as we observed. So yeah, the plot might put us in mind of a novel, but like I said last week, we're missing a lot of other literary elements that we would typically expect to find in a novel or some other work of fiction, and these are the kinds of literary elements that we would often talk about in a literature class. Things like figurative language, character development, certain tropes or themes that the author is trying to make visible. And we might be able to locate, I think we will be able to locate some of that stuff. But don't forget some of the other genres that this text definitely does belong to. So like we said, it is a prime example of a letter of relation. One of these official accounts of an expedition that would have been written by a high-ranking official of the expedition, like Cabeza de Vaca here on the Narvaez expedition. It was his job as treasurer of the expedition to write this account, and it's really sort of addressed to the king, King Charles of Spain. It's kind of intended for the royal audience, and the letters of relation were supposed to largely fill a sort of practical or pragmatic function or purpose, like I said before. They're just sort of describing what they saw, describing the natural resources of the area that they explored, obviously describing the Native American population. But as we said, this letter of relation, Cabeza de Vaca's work, stands apart from other types of other examples of this genre. It's different than other expedition narratives, which are, again, kind of lumped in with that letter of relation genre. These were written by conquerors. These were written by soldiers, high-ranking officials on these expeditions, like Cortez, who wrote his account of the conquest of Mexico a few years before the Narvaez expedition set out. So this is a very established genre, at least amongst Spanish conquistadors, Spanish explorers, but other, colonists would later write these. We mentioned a couple of examples of English language expeditionary narratives penned by the likes of John Smith. Those would come a little later as English colonization of the New World really got underway. We have similar examples from French explorers and some other, we see examples in other national literatures as well. But the Spanish and the Portuguese too, they were really sort of first. And the Spanish were the first European people to conquer really large swaths of territory in the New World. So of course they were writing about it. But again, what sets Cabeza de Vaca's account apart is the interest he takes in Native Americans, the high degree of detail and specificity that he offers when describing, customs, cultural practices, social organizations of these Native American tribes. Previous examples of the genre, they would have mentioned Native Americans, but they wouldn't have offered that level of detail. We could also think of this as a captivity narrative. We mentioned that last time, right? That was a popular genre in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, and at times, Cabeza de Vaca is a prisoner. He is held captive. He is enslaved by some of the Native American tribes that he encounters. The same is true for Dorantes, Castillo, and Estevancio, his fellow survivors. So at times it kind of functions like that popular type of narrative, which again, it wasn't fiction, but it often read like fiction. Captivity narratives did. We mentioned ethnography, which is really a branch of anthropology. It's really a social science, but we can see traces of that as well, as Cabeza de Vaca sort of catalogs a lot of the different cultures that he encounters. He tries to explain them as best he can. We can assume that he's wrong about a lot of things. He certainly does not understand a lot of the cultural practices that he encounters, or he might misinterpret them at times, but he is making an effort, and that's part of the change that we might observe in him. as a character, as our protagonist, if we want to think of him that way. Certainly, he is kind of a dynamic character. He does grow and evolve, largely because his situation, his circumstances change so much over the course of the narratives. But there are ethnographic passages. They're even described that way by the editors of our edition. They talk about some of the ethnography that occasionally does take up space in the narrative. So we can notice that. So what is it? Is it largely a work of self-aggrandizement? I mean, certainly Cabeza de Vaca is often sort of extolling his own virtues and pointing out all the good things that he did. So we can see a lot of traces of self-justification here. A lot of critics have pointed that out. Cabeza de Vaca is often justifying himself, justifying the choices he made to the king, to this royal audience. And we're going to see some pretty obvious reasons for that. But also remember something we mentioned last week. He sort of engaged in a process of self-making. He's sort of remaking himself to a certain extent. Based on these crazy, wild, fantastic experiences that he's had, he does grow a little bit, maybe he does change, and he is presenting himself, by the end of the narrative, he is presenting himself as something a bit different from what we might expect to find within the Spanish colonization project, or the Spanish imperial project that was very much underway. He does stand apart from that in some ways, but he's also complicit in it, and he also supports it in many other ways. So he does prove to be a complex figure, and we can talk more about that in part 2 of today's lecture. So I do want to divide this into a part 1 and a part 2. And I want to start by taking a look at the proem that sort of starts us off here. It starts us before the actual narrative begins. So the proem, which is directly addressed to King Charles, that begins on page 44. So hopefully everybody has our edition of the book by now, so you guys can sort of follow along with me as I point out particular passages. But if you look at that proem, it runs from page 44 to 47. And it's pretty standard stuff for a letter of relation or one of these, official accounts of an expedition like we've talked about. But again, notice the practical function that this genre is supposed to serve. Cabeza de Vaca talks about the things that he has to offer the king. Because remember, the Narvaez expedition failed. They failed to reach their destination. Almost all of the men on the expedition died. So it was a complete failure by most conventional measurements. But Cabeza de Vaca is claiming, in that little opening address to the king, he is claiming that he still has valuable information to offer. So a couple of quotes, I think these are on page 46. He tells the king that his account can help the Spaniards learn more about, quote, location of the lands, distances among them, so like distances between places, and yeah, to an extent, although again, he's a bit inaccurate about distances and places at times, but he also claims to have information on, quote, foodstuffs and animals, along with, and this is important, quote, the diverse customs of the many and barbarous people with whom I conversed and lived. So that's on page 46. So of course, we object, as modern readers, we object to his use of the word barbarous in that final phrase, because of course, yes, he is still prejudiced and he still has that kind of European sense of superiority as it relates to Native American culture, and that would have been true for the vast majority of conquistadors and explorers and royal officials and colonists of this time period. But also notice that in that final item in his list, he mentions the diverse customs of the many and barbarous peoples with whom I lived and conversed. So he's pointing out that these people are diverse, that the different Native American cultures that he's encountered, again, it's not a monoculture, it's not a monolith, they're not all the same. There's many diverse cultures, diverse peoples that he comes into contact with. And yes, he does still consider European civilization to be superior. I don't think he ever loses that quality, but we see how his circumstances, as they change, he has to adapt, he has to adopt certain aspects of Native American culture, and we might see some degree of cultural hybridity a little bit later on as he and his fellow survivors start to combine old world European cultural practices with some of the Native American cultural practices that they are exposed to during their travels. But again, in the proem, he's still making the case that his expedition narrative, his letter of relation, contains valuable info. And he basically says, information is all I could bring back with me. I was naked. I was sort of destitute. I had lost almost all trappings of European, sort of Western European civilization. And that's another thing we're going to observe. When he starts out, early on in the expedition, they're seeing everything through Spanish eyes, which is obvious enough. They're seeing everything from an old world European perspective because, of course, that's what they know. They measure everything they see, all the Native American peoples and customs, even like flora and fauna. They compare almost all of it early on, Cabeza de Vaca primarily, they compare it all to European precedents, right? They're comparing everything they see to what they knew back in Spain, back in Europe. But that worldview, that perspective changes because eventually the expedition just kind of falls apart. I hope I'm not ruining anything by saying that. They go into survival mode. And for a long time, Cabeza de Vaca is living by himself with Native American tribes. So the cultural memory of Europe and the way things were back in Spain, those really stop being as central to him, at least at certain points during his journey. And then eventually, again, we see a certain amount of hybridization. We see a certain amount of cultural exchange where they're not completely, he and his fellow survivors, they're not completely disregarding or forgetting their old European culture, but again, they're sort of combining it with this new culture that they're largely adopting, that they at least have to participate in while they're sort of wandering, while they're on this long journey. So a lot of interesting stuff to work through, both in part 1 and part 2 of this lecture. So again, information is supposed to be what's really valuable here. He has a lot of information to share. And again, we're going to realize that a lot of that information pertains to Native Americans, but also geography, plants, animals, distances between places. He's offering that information to the king. So this is still very much an imperial or a colonial project. He never loses faith in that project, but we do see his mind change and some of his ways will change over the course of the narrative. So, yeah, like I said, I like to break this up kind of into two parts because the expedition, as it gets underway, what we start out with is a pretty standard sort of expedition narrative. But then as things really go off the rails, we have sort of a new section or a sort of new direction that the narrative begins to take, like I said, around page 100, maybe a touch after. That's where Cabeza de Vaca is reunited with these other three guys that I've mentioned, Dorantes, Castillo, and Estevancio. So remember, Castillo and Dorantes are fellow Spaniards, and then Estevancio is a slave originally from, we think, Morocco in North Africa. So he plays an increasingly prominent role as their journey continues. But once those four guys sort of get together, they basically make a break for it. They've largely been enslaved by some of these coastal tribes in what is now like coastal Texas, the Galveston Bay region, where they live for many years. They're not just there for a short time. They're there for multiple years. I think Cabeza de Vaca at one point says he's living alone, separate from those other survivors. He's living alone amongst Native American tribes in the Galveston Bay region for like 4.5 years. But eventually he's able to reunite with these guys. They head southward, kind of getting a little bit closer to Panuco. Remember, that's where they're trying to go, that province in northeastern Mexico, what is now northeastern Mexico, kind of the northernmost settlement that the Spaniards had established up to that point in the New World. And everything north and east of Panuco was what they called Florida, italicized Florida, as it appears in the book. And that's just this vast, unexplored landform that the Spaniards want to learn more about. And that's the purpose of the Narvaez expedition. But of course, they don't land on the coast of Mexico. They land on the west coast of Florida, the Gulf Coast of Florida, the modern day state of Florida, non-italicized version, near present day Tampa Bay. But they're never really super clear on how far away they are from Panuco. So they think they can just kind of hug the coastline and eventually kind of make their way to Panuco. And oddly enough, they almost pull it off, at least the four survivors. They eventually cross the Rio Grande. They enter Mexico. They don't really realize it, but they're back in Mexico. And if they had just continued to hug the coast, the Gulf Coast, and continued to go south from where they were, they would have eventually gotten there. But as we'll see later, they make a change in direction. They head inland and eventually cross the entire breadth of the modern day country of Mexico, and they end up on the other side near the Pacific coast. So we'll talk about the reasons they do that. But once they're reunited and they head towards Mexico, the narrative really changes. Their treatment changes. Like I said, their social status changes. They become healers. They become sort of minor celebrities, we might even argue. And I think Cabeza de Vaca's attitudes and perspectives are obviously changing. The amount of ethnographic detail that he offers increases compared to what we see early on. So again, those are some of the changes that I want us to track. But they first arrive on the Florida Peninsula, the modern day state of Florida, around page 53. So right off the bat, things aren't going well. Their navigator, the pilot of their ship, does not know where he's going. So they end up on the wrong side of the Gulf of Mexico. And pretty early on, we see a pivotal moment in the sort of history of this expedition. And it's another prime example of Cabeza de Vaca offering some self-justification. This is around page 56 and page 57 in our edition. So Narvaez, the leader of the expedition, he wants to go inland. So they're right on the coast. They don't really know where they are. They're sort of trying to collect themselves. And Narvaez wants to go overland. He wants to go inland, sort of away from the coast. And Cabeza de Vaca thinks that's a bad idea. He doesn't think they have sufficient provisions or enough information to undertake a journey like that. So again, we can understand why he's including details like this, because the expedition was a failure, and it seems like he does not want to be blamed for it. Okay, so this is one, obviously it goes wrong with their navigation error, but they also make a mistake here, at least according to Cabeza de Vaca, and the events that we later see play out seem to confirm his position, that they really should not push inland because they don't know the extent of this land. They have no real sense of where they are. They don't know how hostile the local Native American tribes will be. They don't have a lot of supplies. And yeah, they run into some trouble on the peninsula of Florida. They do explore a little bit, but they also run into conflict with Native American tribes. They deal with some geographical difficulties. If anybody's been to Florida, you know it's kind of swampy. There's lots of forest land. There's lots of water, obviously a ton of coastline, but also rivers and lakes and lagoons. They have a hell of a time with some lagoons, trying to get back to the coastline. So at least based on the events we see here, which largely have been verified by Oviedo, that Spanish historian that the editors kind of used to cross-check Cabeza de Vaca's account, it would seem like Cabeza de Vaca was right. They probably made a mistake by pushing inland. But it's a very interesting exchange around page 57, between 57 and 59, when he's telling Narvaez, no, we shouldn't do this. Narvaez insults his honor by saying, okay, well, if you're afraid, you can just stay here on the coast with the ships. And maybe we can, connect with you later on. That's an insult to the honor of Cabeza de Vaca. We have to kind of take a moment to think about the time period here and to think about the kind of guy that Cabeza de Vaca is. I mean, of course, we're generalizing. I don't know a ton about his biography, but he's a conquistador, right? He's a member of the minor nobility from southern Spain. He's a career soldier, but because he was born into a landowning family of some renown, they weren't super important, but they had a pretty good history, so he was educated. But he's, a soldier first and foremost. He's serving the crown on this royal expedition in the New World. But in many ways, he's interesting, and people of this generation were interesting, of his generation, because they were kind of straddling the line between the early modern world and the medieval world. So if we think about the time period here, remember, this is the 1520s. The late 1520s, when the Narvaez expedition gets underway. They leave from Cuba, which the Spanish had already conquered by this point. So the 1520s, that's really kind of at the dawn of what historians would call sort of the modern age, our age, the dawn of modernity. And a lot of things were said to bring on modernity. The development of the printing press, which made books a lot more accessible, the ability to mass produce books, that really raised literacy rates. Also, the Protestant Reformation. Those were happening right around the same time. And then New World exploration. All of this stuff is happening like 1400s, 1500s, the Renaissance gets underway, this flourishing of art and culture really throughout Western Europe. So all of this stuff is kind of happening at around the same time, and Cabeza de Vaca is very much a part of it. But a lot of historians will say that when you look at really early European explorers in the Americas, particularly the early Spanish, they were almost like medieval people. They were coming from, almost medieval Europe, and they were sort of thrust into this brand new environment. So it's almost like the old world, the Middle Ages meet the New World and modernity. We're kind of right at this important sort of turning point in history. But in a lot of ways, yeah, these Europeans who came over, they were almost medieval in terms of how they thought, their culture, their superstitions, the way they viewed religion. So a lot of that colors their early impressions of Native Americans. And of course, they saw Native Americans as very different from them and inferior to them, largely because Native Americans were not practicing Christianity. They did not speak an intelligible language to the Europeans. Their customs were different. Culture was very different. So there was this sort of cultural chauvinism, this superior attitude that many of these conquistadors had, like we've said, but also they're kind of at this pivotal hinge point in history, and they still have a lot of older kind of world views. So just keep that in mind. We're not going to get too much further into history, but just think about that when you think about Cabeza de Vaca and sort of how he's adapting to learning about this new continent, this new world, new people, new ways. And again, if we think of this as kind of a quintessential American text, again, this is kind of a common story for us. People come from Europe or other parts of the world. They come to the US or other parts of the Americas. They kind of interact, maybe intermix with other peoples, and perhaps a new culture emerges. So maybe we're seeing that here. But again, early on, when they're in the modern day state of Florida, we notice that he's still very much operating like an old world kind of medieval guy. He's not terribly interested in the Native Americans that they encounter. He does note that the natives of what is now Florida, the state of Florida, are tall, well-built, often naked, and they are skilled in the arts of archery. They're good with a bow and arrow. But he's mostly just cataloging those traits because the Spanish are fighting with them and they're having some sort of small-scale conflict with some of these local Native American tribes. So his early descriptions of the natives are largely based on physical details. He talks about what they look like, how good they are at making war, but he's not including many cultural details. He's not observing a lot of things about their customs, the way they organize their societies, their religious practices, their sort of familial relationships. Later, he starts to notice all of that. But early in the expedition, when the expedition is still kind of functioning as a real expedition, he's really only viewing the Native Americans as potential enemies, as people that they kind of have to deal with and maybe barter with at times when they're not fighting with them. They also steal from them. They take some Native Americans as sort of like hostages or slaves. So the relationships early on are largely antagonistic. And that's pretty much what we would expect from the Spaniards at this time. Of course, they were there to conquer. They weren't necessarily trying to make friends. They were sometimes willing to enter into alliances with Native American tribes, but only if they were getting food or other resources out of it. And then they would often just turn their backs on that alliance whenever it suited them and either turn on their allies or just abandon them. So pretty much what we expect early on. At first he's viewing Native Americans strictly through this sort of European cultural lens, comparing everything he sees, or at least a lot of the things he sees, to what he would have been accustomed to back in Europe. So again, they kind of wander around Florida. They kind of make their way north, and they hear rumors of this large sort of settlement somewhere in North Florida, referred to as Appalachian. And you guys might be familiar with the Appalachian Mountains, which run from Alabama in the present-day U.S. South all the way up to, the Northeast. I think it's pretty much the same pronunciation, just a different spelling here. So they eventually encounter at least some villages that are affiliated with this large confederation. And this is, again, something that's been kind of verified by historians. We don't know a ton about these large confederations of Native Americans that existed right at first contact with Europeans, because it did not take long for the European presence, even though it started out relatively small in North America, it did not take long for them to disrupt a lot of these social organizations that had previously existed. So there were a lot of large confederations of tribes, large settlements, large sort of settled villages. In some cases, they were quite urban. And you had often pretty diverse populations, like not just a single tribe, but maybe several who had certain kinships or certain relationships. They might have spoken mutually intelligible languages. They would have maybe had similar customs or cultures. They might have descended from similar ancestors. So you had often these sort of really large, militarily and economically powerful organizations or sort of social sort of settlements that early European Spanish explorers encountered. There were a couple of them that we know of, and we don't know exactly what happened to them, but we think largely the Europeans disrupted them and in some cases destroyed them quite deliberately. So Cabeza de Vaca and his fellow members of the expedition, they kind of encounter Appalachian. They steal some corn, I think, from one of these villages. They enter into a little bit of conflict, perhaps, with some of the locals, but they don't really push too far. They don't have the numbers. They don't have they're not operating from such a position of strength anymore. But like later, I think it's Hernando de Soto, a later Spanish explorer, goes through the modern day southeast. I believe he's the first Spaniard to cross the Mississippi River, although I think Cabeza de Vaca sees it during his travels. He doesn't really get into it, but De Soto also encounters perhaps the same civilization, Appalachian or something similar, a very large confederation of tribes, and many historians think that modern day Cherokees and Creek Native Americans, maybe Choctaw, Chickasaw, tribes that in some cases still exist in the South, they might be descendants from this larger sort of civilization that was certainly powerful right before first contact with Europeans, but they did not survive. In most cases, they did not survive that first contact. So they experience a little bit of that, but they sort of divert away from Appalachian, we think. Again, I'm not quite sure where they are. They kind of work their way up into North Florida, and then they sort of make their way back towards the coast. They eventually have to build these rafts. They've lost their ships. They have to build these rafts, these handmade rafts, and they basically start tracking the coast of the Gulf, still trying to get to Panuco, but still not really sure exactly where they are in relation to Panuco. So like I mentioned last time, they really kind of go up across the Florida panhandle, and they're sort of tracking along the Gulf Coast and what is now like coastal Mississippi, coastal Louisiana, not far from New Orleans, and they eventually end up in coastal Texas. So these are some of those adventure-like qualities that we were talking about. Very death-defying, very harrowing when they're on board those rafts. You know, they're losing a lot of men. They don't have enough food. They don't have enough water to drink. Of course, you need drinkable water. So they encounter all these hardships. And during that raft journey, any semblance of the Narvaez expedition that was still in existence up to that point, it vanishes. It's every man for himself. In fact, I want to find this passage if I could. There's another turning point. I think it's page 82, if you guys want to turn there, where I believe it's Narvaez himself who says to Cabeza de Vaca, it's every man for himself. There's no more hierarchy. There's no more authority. He says it was no longer time for one man to rule another. And then after telling Cabeza de Vaca this, he steers his raft away, basically signaling, I'm done being the leader. You guys try to survive, do the best you can. I will do the same. Good luck. And then we never see Narvaez again. The other rafts eventually, I think, get lost. I'm not sure exactly how many rafts land on the island of Mojado in the Galveston Bay off the coast of Texas, but that's where Cabeza de Vaca ends up. And I think that's where a pretty decent number of other survivors, they kind of shipwreck, or if you'd rather, they raft wreck on this island. So again, the editors kind of explained this. This is in the Galveston Bay. You guys might be familiar with Galveston. That's a city in Texas. And there's also an island called Galveston Island. They don't land there. They're on a smaller island just south of the larger Galveston Island. So Cabeza de Vaca dubs this island where they land Mojado, which in translation means like the island of ill fortune or the island of misfortune, because a lot of bad things happen to him and his fellow survivors on that island. But you have to remember, they're not far from the mainland of Texas. So they're kind of going back and forth. It's kind of seasonal travel, largely based on hunting and the Native Americans' food sources. But the survivors become very dependent on a series of different Native American tribes that live here in coastal Texas. So we learned about a lot of reversals in fortune that sort of happened to Cabeza de Vaca during this time. He is enslaved, as you guys may have already seen. He talks about this like around page, I think 90 is where maybe he first mentions that he has been enslaved. He mentions it kind of casually, and this is another thing we might notice about him. He doesn't always offer a ton of detail about certain periods in his life or certain periods of this journey. It sometimes seems like he almost glosses over certain details, even going back to the beginning when they first get lost. And he mentions that the pilot or the navigator, doesn't know where they're going, doesn't know where the port is. He doesn't spend a lot of time on that moment either. So again, and if we were reading a traditional work of fiction, if this was a novel, we would expect moments like these to really be dramatized. Or even that moment when Narvaez is telling him, hey, it's every man for himself, I'm no longer in charge. Like, we could imagine that as a powerful scene in a movie, right? They're on the rafts, they're half starving, and then the rafts part ways. I think Cabeza de Vaca might even be swimming at one point. A lot of the Spaniards cannot swim, but he can. Might be part of the reason why he's able to stay alive. Very dramatic. But because he's not a fiction writer, and because perhaps his primary goal here is not necessarily to entertain, he doesn't always spend a lot of time on those moments. And when he's first enslaved by one of the tribes on Mojado, again, he doesn't really offer a lot of detail or a lot of explanation there. He just sort of states it pretty clearly, but then he moves on. But he does tell us a little bit, like if you look over on page 96, he talks a little bit about some of the sort of difficult and brutal, manual labor that he had to perform while he was enslaved. So he does offer some examples, but he does gloss over things that we might expect him to spend a little bit more time on, and we can think of some potential reasons for that. Again, think about self-presentation, think about self-making, think about self-justification, the way he wants to present himself to the king in this letter of relation. But he sort of gets separated eventually from the other survivors. I don't need to get into all of the machinations here, but just try to keep track as best you can. Again, he jumps around a little bit. He'll jump forward in time, like several years have passed, and he hasn't really always made that clear. But depending on what group he's with, sometimes he's on the mainland and he's treated a little bit better. He tells us that he kind of functions as a merchant with some of these groups. Like, he's allowed to kind of go around selling stuff or kind of engaging in like sort of almost like commercial activity. And then at other times he is enslaved and he's forced to do all of this, all these sort of menial tasks. So he experiences a lot of reversals. But I want to point you guys to a very important passage that occurs on Mojado not long after they land there, to kind of go back to what we were saying earlier about the way he views Native Americans. And, early on, he doesn't pay a ton of attention to them. He's really only concerned with what kind of a threat they pose to the Spaniards. But things are very different now on Mojado. Like I said, the expedition's over. Most of the men on the expedition are dead by now. There's a decent number of survivors that have washed ashore, on Mojado. But remember, they're not in great shape. They're naked, half starved. They've lost virtually all of their supplies. So they're totally at the mercy of these Native American tribes who they encounter. So at this point, all of these trappings of European civilization, their hierarchies, their titles, the way they do things, their cultural practices, their social values, none of that stuff matters as much anymore. It's really an important thing to pay attention to because the expedition's over, and even though they're still Spaniards, now they're just trying to survive. And now they're not operating from a position of power, right? Like they sort of were at the very beginning of the expedition when they still had most of their manpower, they had weapons, they had supplies, but now they have none of those things. So now their relationship with Native Americans understandably changes. And we notice that Cabeza de Vaca does start to pay more attention. He starts to catalog more specific details about cultural practices on Mojado and the mainland of Texas, what is now Texas, the stuff that he's observing. So this is a big departure from where we were back on the peninsula. Where, they just didn't really have that attitude. And even when they first land on Mojado, we still see a lot of the prejudice. We see a lot of their sort of judgment, comparing this stuff to what they know. And one of the more telling moments of this is on page 93. This always makes me laugh a little bit, but it's not only a sort of amusing and very interesting moment, it also sets the tone for what's to come. It sets the stage for these guys' future roles. So the first full paragraph on page 93, he says that on that island, Mojado, they tried to make us physicians without examining us or asking us for our titles. That opening part of the passage always makes me laugh because, again, he's thinking about European standards, right? He's thinking about the way medicine is practiced back in Spain, where you would have needed to have certain credentials, you would have needed to go to school for that. I mean, they had, of course, colleges and degrees back then. So he's thinking about those kinds of standards, those kinds of social norms. But of course, the Native Americans, these particular Native Americans in particular, they practice medicine in a different way. They have a different culture, different sort of social formations. But he's holding them to his old world European standards. So notice the initial reaction here. And he goes on to say they wanted us to be physicians. And he describes some of their medical practices, how they would cure illnesses by blowing on the sick person. And he goes on to say, and they demanded that we do the same and make ourselves useful. We laughed about this, he says. We laughed about this, saying that it was a mockery and that we did not know how to cure. And because of this, they took away our food until we did as they told us. So a lot of important stuff's happening here. Number one, we see a lot of his cultural chauvinism kind of laid bare. They're literally mocking the Native Americans. They're laughing at them, saying, we're not doctors. We don't know how to cure people. We don't have the proper training and credentials. So they find it comical. They think it's a mockery. They laugh at it. But the joke's really on them, because when they refuse, the Native Americans who they're with, they just take the food away and say, all right, well, if you don't want to do it, I guess you don't want to eat either. So they have to go along with it. They're realizing that they are not dealing from a position of strength. They have to go along with whatever the tribe tells them to do. So they do. And this is where they start to operate as healers. Now, they're not doing it all the time in coastal Texas, but later they will assume this social role, this job, pretty much on a full-time basis. And their success, or at least their perceived success, will dictate a lot of change. that we can observe. It will change their social status. It will change their quality of life. And it will largely change the way they interact with Native Americans. So we're going to see more of that kind of in the second half of the narrative. So again, this is kind of the hinge point. This is a really pivotal transitional period as the expedition has completely fallen apart. It's survival mode. And then on the other side of their experiences on Mojado, about 10 to 12 pages after the point where we are here on 93, when they reunite and they start heading south, that's really kind of a whole new narrative. Really, it's a brand new world for them. And everything that happens from that point on is quite different than what we saw back on the peninsula of Florida, on the rafts, or on Mojado, or the mainland coast of Texas. So again, if you guys are looking for a stopping place, it's good to be around this area here, in this sort of separation point by, early in week 2. So you can tackle the second half of the narrative this week. So again, look at a map, get sort of comfortable with where they are, look at how much ground they've already covered, and we can get ready for sort of the next installment of their travels. So I think I want to go ahead and stop. I'm going to stop part 1 here, and then we'll come back and talk about the second half of the narrative in part 2.